Welcome to my hip replacement vlog. This is a new project I'm starting because I was recently diagnosed with arthritis in my right hip. This was my first hip vlog almost 3 years ago when I was first diagnosed as having arthritis in my hip and needing total hip replacement. And I'm excited for the opportunity now to update it and make it more helpful for you in deciding whether it's time for you to have total hip replacement or perhaps it's time to wait a little bit. And if you've already made the decision to get total hip replacement, then hopefully this will serve as confirmation that you made the right decision. Stay tuned to the end, where I'll share tips on choosing the right surgeon once you've made the decision to go forward with total hip replacement. The video is organized by the key questions that most of us ask ourselves when trying to decide whether it's time for total hip replacement. As you watch the video, you can fill out this handy scorecard, which you can find on my companion website, hipvlog.org. This is a very personal decision, and everyone's situation is unique. So I hope this helps you make your decision. And I wanted to let you know that this is not just based on my own input and my own experiences, but I collaborated with hundreds of other hippies on social media platforms to try and come up with the best questions that one would ask when trying to decide whether it's time for hip surgery or not. The first question is my quality of life degraded? And that's a very subjective question, but I've provided you a way in the scorecard to sort of indicate how big of a deal it is for you right now and to make notes about where it might have degraded your quality of life. I wanted to share some great resources if you haven't already checked them out. I've made it easy by including links in this video's description. My website, hipvlog.org, contains lots of helpful resources, including an email system that will send you timely tips and information directly to your inbox throughout your hip journey. So I hope you'll take a minute now to invest in your recovery by subscribing to my YouTube channel, website, and Facebook groups. If you like my content, please share it with others and check out my other YouTube channel, Game of Life 411. Who knows, we might have some other interests in common. Thanks for watching, and now back to the video. So go ahead and take a minute now if you haven't already to print out that scorecard from my website, hipvlog.org. I'll wait. I'm just a recording, so you can press pause if you like. And now that you've got your scorecard handy, I'll share some of the things that were going through my mind 3 years ago. About 6 months ago, I thought that I'd pulled my groin. It was on the inner part of my thigh and sort of where my hip flexes, and lifting up my right leg was just very, very painful. Over the course of 6 months, I tried every self-treatment I could think of. I went for inactivity and rest for weeks at a time. I tried all the different NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, things like Tylenol or acetaminophen, ibuprofen, aspirin, even Voltaren, which is a topical NSAID. The functional ingredient there is diclofenac. So I would typically try one of those NSAIDs for like a week, see if it had any effect, and then discontinue use. None of those had a long-term beneficial effect. I also tried deep tissue massage, I tried stretching, icing. So each of these things I tried multiple times, often for a week at a time, over the course of the last 6 months. Nothing was making it better, it was only getting worse. The next question is one that my surgeon asked me, and it really resonated with me. I think it's one of the key factors in deciding whether or not you want to go forward with this surgery. And the question is my hip making decisions for me? And what that really means is it preventing me from doing things that I would otherwise like to do? Am I deciding not to do things because of my hip mobility issues or pain? Right? Another way that I like to think of it is it preventing me from doing the things that I love with the people that I love? So give that a little bit of thought and fill out your scorecard right now while I share some additional thoughts. Activity of almost any kind was making it worse, whether that was volleyball or biking or running or hiking. Anything where I was using my legs or on my feet just seemed to make it worse. And it got so bad that I was unable to sleep at night because every time I would straighten my leg, it would just be excruciating pain all through my hip, my inner thigh, all the way down to the inner side of my knee. It's a weird situation because, on the one hand, you're in pain, but they don't tell you to really stop your activities. There might be certain activities you should stop. For example, the doctor did tell me to halt any high-impact activities such as running, so I'm not going to run anymore. He seemed to be okay with my sand volleyball. If that was indoor volleyball, I'm quite sure he would not have been okay with it because that would be very high impact. Thankfully, the sand is very forgiving, and I don't jump all that much, so I think it's a reasonable activity, and he didn't seem bothered by it. I sent my original doctor a written summary of where I thought I was and just trying to capture the situation and make sure that I understood it correctly. Here's how I would summarize my situation. Please let me know if this sounds about right. The doctor responded that he thought that was about right. So it's up to me to decide when the pain is no longer manageable. I'm going to be going to Peru in a few weeks to hike the Inca Trail, And I just wanted to make sure that my understanding was correct and that I was okay to do this. I talked to the doctor and basically said as long as I can handle the pain, then there's nothing wrong with doing the Inca Trail. In fact, staying active is a good thing. While you're trying to manage and live with the pain, it's best for your joints, even if they are painful, to have motion and activity that keeps blood flowing, that keeps them mobile. So it's this sort of weird two-edged sword. You want to be active, you want to be mobile. That's healthy for the joints and healthy for your body in general. But you have to do that and balance it with the pain that's going to come along with that activity.
Okay, next question. Can I perform my daily responsibilities? And that can be many things. That can be work, that can be family related. Am I sleeping well enough to function? Things like that. So take a minute now to fill out your scorecard.
So now I'm trying to figure out what the right time is for me to do the surgery. I think the right answer is to do it soon because it is affecting my sleep. I've always struggled with getting enough sleep, and this is just making it that much harder. So I think that the right answer is to have surgery sooner rather than later.
Okay, the next question is my health or fitness suffering because of my bad hip? And this is sort of a multifaceted question. So I'm going to refer to some notes to give you some additional context here. So number one, in terms of health, that could be both physical health as well as mental health, right? So are you suffering from depression because you can't do the things that you love? Is there some other issue that you're having either with mental health or physical health that this hip is contributing to? One of the other things to mention is that if you are becoming less fit because you can't do the kinds of things that you want to do to stay fit due to your hip, then that can make your recovery much harder and longer. So another reason perhaps to go forward with a surgery rather than wait. Or am I compensating because of my bad hip? If I'm limping or doing other things because of the bad hip, then that can set off all kinds of imbalances in the body, and the body will start compensating, and that can cause other problems, some of them temporary, some of them permanent. So again, another factor to consider, and you may have your own, so go ahead and fill out your scorecard now.
I wanted to touch briefly on the emotional well-being of patients who have been diagnosed with hip arthritis. I admit to having felt some depression. I would not classify it as severe, but it's not a good feeling to find out that your body is breaking down. And throughout most of my life, most of my injuries have been soft tissue injuries, so sprains or pulled muscles or knots or things that I was able to self-treat or with help from a physical therapist get through. This is not something I can do that with. It is, I think, real and natural to feel some depression when you're undergoing something like this. But if you're feeling that, to a large extent, you probably need to seek some help. I do kind of feel like my body's betraying me. So at any rate, I'm having to accept that pain is a part of the aging process. And so at this point, I just need to accept my limitations. I need to accept the pain that I'm going through, although I know that I can have the surgery and make it better with some intent and perseverance. So accept and persevere is kind of the state I'm at right now. I try to dispel those depressing thoughts whenever they pop into my head and just focus on the positive and focus on making the situation better.
Am I worried about the effects of any medications I'm taking because of my bad hip? And that's important because these things taken long term can put strain on your liver, your kidneys, and other parts of your body. So you have to really think about the medications, and they do have repercussions. Go ahead and take a moment now to fill out your scorecard. I'll just twiddle my thumbs while I wait for you. Now here's one you might not have thought of. Is my hip pain negatively affecting the people around me? And it's hard because, when we're suffering with a bad hip, then typically we're focused on ourselves. But oftentimes this can manifest itself in ways that affect the people around us. And I'll give the example of a very close relative. He had a bad hip. He was in pain because of a car accident that sort of exacerbated things. And he tried to self-medicate by drinking and was just a grouch and very unpleasant to be around for several years. Now, eventually he got past that, thank goodness. And he ended up having a procedure for his hip and getting some other things fixed. But wow, it really affected his relationships with everyone that was close to him. So I would encourage you to do some introspection and make sure that you're not taking out your frustrations or your pain on the ones around you. Okay, this is a lot more comfortable than that Star Trek uniform. This is a seersucker cotton shirt that I've had for many years. In fact, this is a picture of me with my daughter. in the same shirt, and she is now 24 years old. I wanted to point it out because, if you've looked at any of my other content, I'm a pretty frugal guy, and I am trying to help as many people as possible succeed financially as well. And I have sort of a soft spot for the young people, like my kids, right? They're in their 20s, from 20 to 24. So I'm making content for that audience. And I'm sure if you're learning about total hip replacement, then you probably have some people in that age range, the 20s, the 30s, in your life. So please share my content with them, not this hip vlog, but point them to my original channel, Game of Life 411, where I try to help everyone win at the game of life, whether that's family, fitness, finance, whatever it means to you. Is my hip bone on bone? And while you're filling out your scorecard, I'm going to ask Pre-Op Pete to explain why this is important to you in your recovery.
One of the considerations that the doctor shared with me has to do with the timing. He himself has had both his hips replaced, so it was great to talk to a surgeon who has done the procedure, dealt with hundreds of patients, and then also undergone the surgery himself. He did the surgery on his two hips at different stages of development. What he explained to me is that the first stage is the inflammatory stage, when you still have cartilage, but it's damaged and you've got bone growth rubbing against that and causing continued damage. Evidently, this causes a lot of inflammation to the joint, and that spreads throughout that part of the body. The second stage of arthritis is bone on bone. So that's when all the cartilage is gone and the bones are just rubbing against each other. It's still painful because the bones have nerves in them. But what he explained to me is that if you have a hip replacement done when it's bone on bone, immediately after the surgery, you will feel better. And the recovery appears to be fairly quick. Whereas if you have it done earlier during the inflammatory stage, because you're already inflamed, the surgery can cause a lot more inflammation and the recovery time can be much longer. He himself experienced this. My surgeon is not entirely sure that I should have surgery done at this time. There seems to be a balance between having the surgery done and persevering with the pain until a later date and then having the surgery.
Does my surgeon think it's time for me to get total hip replacement? And if not, is it time to get a second opinion? In my own case, my x-rays did not show a hip that was obviously so bad that I needed to have it replaced, but I was in a lot of pain, so I persisted and requested an MRI. And when the surgeon saw the MRI, he was like, "Oh, yeah, definitely, you're ready for total hip replacement." So if your surgeon's initial reaction is that you're not ready for total hip replacement, then you might need to challenge that or get a second opinion. Do I have any medical issues that might increase my risk of problems or cause me trouble during my recovery from total hip replacement? The bottom line, of course, is that the healthier you are going into surgery, the easier your recovery is going to be. And if you have some health challenges or what they sometimes call comorbidities, then that can make your surgery and your recovery more risky and more challenging. There are so many things that this could entail that it's impossible to list them all, but just to give you an idea, some folks have challenges with pain medications and anti-inflammatories, so that could be a challenge during your recovery or just dealing with the pain from the surgery. Other folks might have problems with low blood pressure, they might be overweight, and certain surgeons will not operate on you unless your BMI is within a certain range, so that can be a challenge. So do a thorough assessment of your current medical condition and talk to your surgeon about whether you have any medical conditions that might put you at risk or make your recovery more difficult. Am I too young or too old to have total hip replacement? I'm including this one. It's very important because there have been changes in medical science around total hip replacement in the last 10 to 15 years. In fact, things are always changing and improving. So outcomes are different. The longevity of the implants is different. And anyhow, let me share a little bit of information from Pre-Op Pete.
In the past, it was thought that the hip replacement hardware would only last about 10 or 15 years, but there have been more recent studies, and it looks like these can last 20 to 30 years without any replacement or adjustments being made. So I'm almost 55. If I can get 20 years of continued activity and use, I would prefer that because that will put me at 75 years old. I don't know how active I'll be at 75. I don't know if I'll even be alive at 75. God willing, I will be, but who knows? So I think that getting a hip replacement now is a good idea.
So we know modern hip implants should last easily 20 to 30 years. And my surgeon also told me that typically there's enough bone in your femur to have up to 2 total hip replacements done in your lifetime. So if I can get 30 years out of one and 30 years out of a second, that's 60 years. So at 20 years old, am I too young to have total hip replacement? Well, according to this, I would still be on my second hip by the time I hit the age of 80 years old. So I think the answer would be no. Now, the other side of this is, am I too old for total hip replacement? And that really depends on one of the earlier questions, your health and your fitness, because there is an age at which it might not make sense to do this. Now, of course, every situation is unique. It might depend on how debilitating it is. It might depend on how much pain it puts you in. But at a certain age, it's going to be really hard to bounce back from a surgery like this because it is major surgery. So I would caution you to think through it very carefully and discuss it with your surgeon. Can I afford total hip replacement? I would say most people do not pay for the surgery themselves. Usually you're getting it covered by insurance or a nationalized healthcare system like the British NHS or the American Medicare or Medicaid system. But you need to figure out, will this be covered? Is it approved? Or if you're going to have costs out of pocket, can you cover those? Will you be okay financially being off from work while you recover? And things like that. Will total hip replacement solve my pain? If you notice a common thread through all these questions, it's that every situation is unique and very personal. So in terms of whether or not surgery will solve your particular pain, that's a bit of a question, right? Some people will have pain in their hip joint, and probably your odds are pretty good that total hip replacement will fix that. But other people have pain in other areas. There have been reports of people with pain down their leg, into their feet. Mine was in my groin. I also have pain in my lower back. Some people with hip replacement think they may have back problems or back pain because of their bad hips. And it gets tricky because you can't guarantee that the pain you're feeling is being caused by a bad hip and that replacing the bad hip is going to solve that pain problem. So you have to kind of think that through and weigh the risks and the benefits because you may not be 100% pain-free after total hip replacement. It just depends. Now, the odds are good and the outcomes are very good for total hip replacement. Typically, people are getting their lives back and enjoying a lack of pain and increased mobility. There are no guarantees. So think through what is particularly causing you pain and try to talk to your surgeon to see what are the odds, what's the probability that he thinks total hip replacement is going to resolve that pain. But wait, my hip feels pretty good today. Should I put off my hip surgery? Well, again, complicated question, and there are lots of reasons, but it's fairly typical for folks who are experiencing a bad hip and have scheduled total hip replacement to have second thoughts. I know I did. And I don't know if it's physical pain or if there's a psychological effect, but it seems pretty common that as surgery approaches, folks might experience less pain or they might feel better or there might be an excuse where they might want to postpone their surgery. So you have to think through this. And I included it here. It's kind of a trick question. It's not really something that you consider when trying to decide if you should have total hip replacement or not, because honestly, it can change on a daily basis. I can give my mom as a good example here. We both had total hip replacements 2 years ago, and she had had some hip pain and gone to the doctor and been diagnosed as having arthritis in her hip and that she needed a total hip replacement, but she didn't want the surgery. And so she chose to just buck it up and try and survive with the pain and put up with it. Well, all of a sudden, one day, she's like, the pain is excruciating and I need surgery right now, immediately, today. This can't continue. I have to have surgery. The pain is unbearable. Well, guess what? That's not how it works. You don't get to say, I'm having surgery today. It all depends on surgeons and availability. And in her case, we had to arrange for my sister and myself to help care for her after the surgery. So it's a tricky situation. And I would just ask you to think through that. And if you're feeling so good that you think you might put off your surgery, well, think again and try and think through some of the other reasons why you might still want to have that surgery. And that's it. Those are the key questions that we all struggle with when we're trying to decide whether or not it's time for total hip replacement. Now, I will say that when I was bouncing these ideas off of some other hippies on social media, there were some other questions that were suggested, and I didn't include those here for a very specific reason. I don't think that they're necessarily questions that you would have to have answers to before you decide to have total hip replacement or not. I think these are questions that you need to address and make sure you have answers to once you've decided to have total hip replacement. And I'll give you an example. So for example, do I have a caregiver to support my recovery? That's very important. Not everybody has that, but again, it's a very important consideration that you need to think through and try to arrange if you can. But there's no point doing that until you have decided that you're going to have total hip replacement. It's also not a reason to choose not to have total hip replacement because there are ways you can work around that, right? If you don't have friends or family, you might be able to reach out to someone at church. There are organizations like Helping Angels that you can hire someone to come in and help you as needed. So don't get into analysis paralysis and worry about factors that you really don't have any control over and you shouldn't worry about until after you've made the decision to have total hip replacement. Now, once you've made that decision, and maybe you're ready to make that decision now based on how your scorecard came out and your consideration of all these questions, once you've made that decision, this pre-op video and the checklist on my website, hipvlog.org, will help you get through the rest of it. If you think total hip replacement is in your future, then the best tip I can give you today is to sign up for Your Hip Journey. That is my email system that will provide you timely tips, information, and encouragement on a daily basis according to where you are in your hip journey. And if you don't have a surgery date yet, don't worry about that. Go ahead and sign up, and you can go in and update your surgery date as soon as you have one. So if you think you've made a decision now to go forward with total hip replacement, then the next logical question is, how do I find a good surgeon? And someone recently asked that question about, are there resources or what sort of questions should I ask surgeons to interview them and make sure I get the right one for me? Well, there are a lot of things to consider, but one of the things that I always think about is the overall complication rate. And I remember my surgeon had an incredibly low overall complication rate of something like 0.3%. Well, I found this Danish study. While the numbers and the percentages might not be identical in your country, it should give you a pretty good idea. So what they found in looking at almost 50,000 patients getting total hip replacement, within the first year, there was an overall complication rate of about 2.3%. And that included things like infections, dislocations, etc. Basically, when you're interviewing a surgeon, you want to know what their overall complication rate is, and you want to shoot for someone who has a very low one. I'm not going to say that 0.3% is typical by any stretch of the imagination. That was exceptional, and I was very grateful to have my surgeon. But as you're interviewing surgeons, you want to shoot for something as low as possible. Now, there are some other questions you want to ask, and really what I find is that you have surgeons who have kept up with medical science and are employing some of the latest and greatest techniques and tools and things like that. And then you have others who maybe haven't kept up or have some outdated notions about total hip replacement and the outcomes from it. So these next things are meant to help you weed out those dinosaurs and make sure that whichever surgeon you choose is employing modern muscle-sparing techniques, modern prosthetics, and all the good things that modern medicine provides. As you're interviewing surgeons, ask them about the healing timeline, restrictions, and physical therapy. For example, if they say that they'll prescribe formal physical therapy after your total hip replacement, ask them why. Only about 50% of total hip replacement surgeons recommend any formal PT after total hip replacement, and 50% do not. Hopefully your surgeon has a good answer to this. If not, then you might be dealing with someone who just prescribes PT because that's what they prescribe for every type of surgery. As you're discussing restrictions, if the surgeon mentions anything like a 90-degree bending restriction, then they're probably operating out of antiquated information. This was very prevalent in the olden days, especially with the posterior approach. But from what I understand, it's not such a big deal anymore. And although we always have to use common sense, you really shouldn't have a 90-degree restriction for a very long period of time. And the final one is really important because it informs everything else that they're going to recommend in your recovery. It has to do with the healing timeline. There's a common misconception that the implant will bond with your femur in the same time frame as it would take for a fractured bone to heal. Well, that's not accurate based on the best research I've been able to find on the subject. It actually takes about 9 months. And that's because the bone that cracks during a fracture is very different from the internal bone of your femur that you're trying to bond to your implant. So if they answer you that it's 6 weeks and then you have no restrictions, then you really have to question them about that. And in fact, I do have a handout on my website, hipvlog.org, that you can print out and give to them because they may not be aware of the latest research on this topic. So those are my tips and suggestions for interviewing surgeons. Look for one with a low overall complication rate. Try and figure out if they're using modern techniques by asking questions about physical therapy, range of motion restrictions, and also the healing timeline. Thanks for watching. And if you found my video helpful, please do me a solid, share it with others who might need it. Give me a like, make a comment. That just drives those YouTube algorithms crazy so it can be viewed by more and more people. Thanks in advance. I really appreciate your support.
It's your world and I'm just a squirrel trying to get a nut to move your butt.
Explore all the free resources and helpful information throughout your hip journey by joining the Pete's Hip Vlog community and subscribing to my YouTube channel, Pete's Hip Vlog. If you like my content, I hope you'll also check out and subscribe to my primary channel, Game of Life 411, where my goal is to help you win at the game of life, whether that means finance, family, fitness, or something else. And remember, you're in charge of your own health.